hang on. Oh, there we go. Good evening. Hi. I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the president. Oh my goodness, keep it coming, keep it. I'm the president and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and it's so wonderful to have you all here tonight for our 4th annual Mittelman-Berman Holocaust Education Series. You all get a gold star for not sitting at home and watching the Rangers. So, and I've been told that during Q&A I can give you a Rangers update. So stay off your phones during this. So before we begin tonight's program, I know I've been silly, but I want to be serious for just a minute. I'd like to talk briefly about what we've all been going through the past few weeks. We have, at the museum, and really all of us, have watched in horror as Hamas, a terrorist group governed by hatred of Jews, has committed horrendous attacks with the goal of destroying Israel, the world's only Jewish country. We've wept with the families of Israel and around the world who have lost loved ones or are living through unbearable anguish while their loved ones are held hostage by Hamas. We grieve for innocent civilians who are tragically caught up in the devastation of war. We worry about the continued spread and growth of anti-Semitism worldwide as we see it spewed on college campuses, in the media, and in public demonstrations. And we know that a world without a strong Israel is a world unsafe for Jews. I'm not sure if we should clap for that because it's sobering, but it's important. So thank you for underscoring that. Last month's attacks in Israel constitute the deadliest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. They shake us to our core and also strengthen our convictions in the importance of our mission to teach the history of the Holocaust and advance human rights, to combat prejudice, hatred, and indifference. Knowing our past is a vital part of accomplishing our educational mission. And the Mittelman-Berman Education Series informs and educates about this important history. I'd like to thank the generous supporters of the series, Julie Meetal-Berman and Dr. Joseph N. Berman. Julie and Joe, we are so grateful for your support of the museum, this series, and Holocaust education in our community. We'll hear words from Julie and Joe shortly. But first, I'd like to thank our community partners for tonight's program: Agape Clinic, Green Hill School, SMU Human Rights Program, Southwest Jewish Congress, the Legacy Senior Communities, and Temple Shalom. And finally, I'd like to give a special welcome to our museum members, our board members, and volunteers joining us this evening. Thank you so much for all you do to support me personally and the museum. We couldn't do this work without you. If you are visiting maybe for the first time, or you've been coming for a while and would like to get engaged, we'd love to have you sign up as a volunteer. We'd really appreciate you becoming a member to help support this work. So please consider doing both of those. And now I'd like to welcome Julie and Joe Berman to share a few words about the Mittelman-Berman Holocaust Education Series. Julie is one of our second-generation speakers, and we're very, very thankful for all she does to help teach students throughout North Texas and beyond about the history of the Holocaust. Julie and Joe, come on up.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out tonight for this annual Mittelman-Berman Holocaust Education Series. My husband and I created this series to ensure that Holocaust education will always be available for future generations. Each year we try to bring a speaker who will bring relevance, inspiration, who will educate and alert all of us and most importantly, keep our collective family's memory remembered and honored. We created this series in memory of my parents, Magda and Laszlo Mittelman, of blessed memory. Both of them were Holocaust survivors. Tonight's speaker, Laurel Leff, will be speaking about the New York Times during the Holocaust. How timely. Because once again, right now, we're seeing and still reeling from another Holocaust, another pogrom. And now we're seeing the blatant anti-Semitism and Jew hatred all over the world, and especially here in the United States. The New York Times, once again, is demonstrating their biased opinions by blaming the victims for defending themselves. We're thrilled to have Ms. Leff at this particular time. We want to thank the staff for helping us make this possible. I hope you enjoyed the evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming. 1,400 Jews killed in one day, the most Jews killed in one day since the Holocaust. And how do we know that, or don't know that? We know that through the media and the relevance and journalistic integrity of the media, which is why it is so timely that this particular topic is going to be discussed tonight. The journalistic integrity of the media is all we know in the next few days, the next few years, and 20 years from now. All of this will be written down by someone and written about by someone else, and all that will have to be hopefully correct and not hidden from all of us. Why has the Holocaust been buried by the journalists such as the New York Times? Why should an organization that is owned by Jews deny or bury or hide the relevance of the Holocaust? It makes no sense. And I'm sure our speaker tonight will discuss these various properties. She's a professor of journalism at Northeastern University. And journalism and integrity of journalism, I think, has been already shown to be compromised throughout the world today, here in the United States, in Great Britain, and in many other countries, already demonstrated on the networks. So I look forward to hearing her comments. I look forward to hopefully having this new, unfortunate, new generation, this new and unfortunate new Holocaust be documented correctly with the people on the right side and the people on the wrong side appropriately designated. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julie and Joe. We really appreciate your generosity and your passion for Holocaust education. It makes a difference. So as Julie and Joe said, tonight we are pleased to welcome and learn from Professor Laurel Leff. She's a professor of journalism and the Associate Director of Jewish Studies at Northeastern University in Boston. She also teaches a course on America and the Holocaust. Prior to her academic career, Professor Leff was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the Miami Herald. She is also an accomplished author. Her latest book, Well Worth Saving: American University's Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe, was a finalist for a 2020 National Jewish Book Award. Her previous book, Buried by the Times: The Holocaust and America's Most Important Newspaper, was chosen as the best media history book by the American Journalism Historians Association. We will have time, as always, for questions after Professor Leff's talk. Please write your questions on the note cards we provided you as you entered. And if you are joining us virtually, put them in the chat box, and we will do our best to answer as many of those questions as possible. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Leff, or Professor Leff.
That's okay. Hi, everyone. Oh, I can't see anyone, I guess, from the lights. I guess that's why. I really do appreciate that you're all here, and not just because you're missing the Rangers game. But, you know, as has been said, we've all gone through a really difficult 3.5 weeks, and it's an act of courage to sort of face it and to be willing to go back and look at another even darker period in Jewish history. But I think it's worth it. I think it's important to learn some of the lessons, especially as I'll be discussing tonight. Some of the things that we were taught about this period, and particularly about the press coverage of it, turned out not to be correct. So I'm hoping that there will be some lessons here. And I do also, just to reiterate, that my favorite part of this is answering questions, so I hope as I'm talking, I know you can write down questions, but you're thinking about some of the things that you might want to ask me. But we're going to start by going back to March 2nd, 1944, and that's a typical news day, if any day could be considered typical in the midst of a world war. On the front page of the New York Times, and there you can see it right up there, that's what the New York Times looked like in 1944. On the front page, the Allies were holding off a German drive near Anzio in Italy. The Red Army was making steady progress, retaking parts of the Soviet Union that the Germans had seized at the beginning of the war. And then if you turn to the inside pages, the War Manpower Commission was setting up veteran information centers in New York State. West Point was retaining its unbeaten streak in basketball. The stock market was regaining ground. And then if you turn to page 4, amid 13 other stories appeared this item that you see before you. And I'm going to be showing stories, but don't feel like you have to strain too much to read the stories. I'm going to give you the highlights, and then I'm also hoping that they'll be able to post it, so if you want to go back and actually read these stories more carefully, you can. But this will at least give you an idea of what the stories look like in the actual time period. So this particular story is about a House of Commons debate on whether to appropriate funds to the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees. And then came these paragraphs. You can see it's in the second column. And I'm going to read it. I'm not going to read a lot, but sometimes the actual words that were used in the story are important. I think this is one of those times. So during this discussion, S.S. Silverman, labor member, read a report from the Jewish National Committee operating somewhere in Poland, saying, and this is the words of the Jewish National Committee, "Last month, we still record the number of Jews in the whole territory of Poland as from 250,000 to 300,000. In a few weeks, no more than 50,000 of us will remain. In our last moment before death, the remnants of Polish Jewry appeal for help to the whole world. May this, perhaps our last voice from the abyss, reach the ears of the whole world." Without skipping a beat, the story continued. The Commons also approved an installment of £3,863 to help the International Red Cross open an office in Shanghai. The journalists at the New York Times did not respond to that anguished cry from the abyss, not on that day or any of the 2,076 days of the European war. From the start of the war in Europe on September 1st, 1939, to its end nearly 6 years later, the New York Times and other mass media treated the persecution and ultimately the annihilation of the Jews of Europe as a secondary story. They reported it, and this is what my research found, There were 1,186 stories about what was happening to the Jews of Europe, or an average of a story every other day. So it was in the newspaper. But the story of the Holocaust made the Times front page only 26 times, and that would have been out of 24,000 front page stories. And in only 6 of those were the stories identified Jews as the primary victims on the front page. So what I'd like to do tonight is to try and explain how that could have happened, how journalists at the New York Times and elsewhere could have been confronted with the facts of mass murder on an unprecedented scale and for unimaginable reasons, and yet have reacted as if they had no understanding of what those facts meant, as you could see from the first example I gave you. And I should say just a little bit about why focusing on the New York Times, which is what I'm going to do. The New York Times was probably more comprehensive than the American newspapers generally, but all newspapers, including the Dallas Morning News, as one of the exhibits here shows, had these kinds of stories and had them almost all on the inside pages. So what I'm going to start with is the explanations that have been offered for this that I don't think hold up. And the first explanation is that the information was unavailable. Some of you who attended Hebrew school in the 1960s or the 1970s, as I did, were probably taught that the Holocaust was a deep, dark secret. And until Americans liberated the concentration camps in April and May of 1945, the information was something that was unknown and unknowable. But over the last couple decades, a consensus has emerged that a considerable amount of information reached the British government, the American government, Jewish groups, the Catholic Church, which is my current research, the Red Cross, and the news media about what was happening to the Jews in Europe. And I think it's now gotten to the point, and this I hope is a little different when I started speaking about Buried by the Times, which is that anyone who makes that argument now just doesn't know the facts. They just don't know what was happening. And it's still being said, though. I noticed a few days ago that a Fox commentator was criticizing the Times coverage of the destruction of a Gaza hospital, and believe me, there's a lot to criticize in the Times coverage. But what struck me was his statement that the New York Times knows, and this is a direct quote, the New York Times knows what they are doing and they are responsible for it, just like they did not report the Holocaust in real time. But the Times did report the Holocaust in real time. They published 1,186 stories about it. So this clearly was not something that was a secret if it was in major American newspapers. But it's still, I think, hard to grasp how much information was available, how detailed it was, how timely it was. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to just take you through some of these stories. And remember, again, there are over close to 1,200 stories, so I'm just giving you a very, very small sampling of them. I mean, one of the nice things now, and again, this is a little bit different when I started doing this research, it's anybody who has a subscription to the New York Times can do a search and can find all of these stories, so we can no longer kind of pretend that this information is not there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the first 2.5 years of the war, so that's basically going from September of '39 with the invasion of Poland up until the end of 1941. And what you would have found in the New York Times, and here's again, this is what an inside page looked like, just again to give you a feel of it. But there were stories about the anti-Semitic legislation that was adopted in the countries that were allied with Germany or occupied with Germany, and in the Reich itself. And what this story is about, as you can see from this headline, it says "Strolling Bard to Jews in Berlin." And it says that the latest anti-Jewish measure makes it an offense for Jews to stroll along the street at a leisurely pace. They have to walk briskly. They cannot greet anyone. They cannot stop to look in store windows. And there's actually been a special police force created to make sure that Jews are not strolling. And what the story says here in the second column, under the boldface, is that this reduces the rights of Jews to zero. All they can do is wait deportation to the east, which every Reich Jew now realizes is his ultimate fate. And then there were lots of stories about those deportations, just little stories saying, these Jews have left Vienna, these Jews have left Berlin. This story is about Jews leaving Berlin, more Berlin Jews shipped to Poland. And what's kind of interesting about this one is that there is a reporter, it's not a New York Times reporter, this is a United Press story that appeared in the New York Times, but a United Press reporter who's actually watching the deportation of the Jews. And the very last paragraph indicates that some people have gone to the freight yard to see the Jews off. Some of them are now leaving. And the last paragraph says, those Jews leaving the yard showed few signs of emotion. One was asked whether the train was made up of passenger or freight cars. Casting a quick glance over his shoulder, he said, freight cars, but they are full of people. And then you had stories about the establishment of ghettos. And one of the reasons why I like to show these stories is you can see how hard it is to find them on the page, right? I mean, when we're talking about inside stories, it's not like one or two stories. Often there were 30 stories on an inside page. So this story is about the establishment, or not the establishment of, but the wall sealing off the Warsaw Ghetto. There had already been lots of stories about ghettos being created, but this is actually saying that the Warsaw Ghetto is now sealed off. And one thing that's interesting about this story, you can see from the lead, about 500,000 Jews will begin tomorrow a new life behind an 8-foot concrete wall built by the Germans. But notice that's the following day. This is not hearsay. This is not, 3 months after it's happened. This is tomorrow, the Warsaw Ghetto is going to be closed off. And then there are stories about what the conditions were like in those ghettos. This is a story, again, about Warsaw, which, as you know, was the largest of the ghettos. So death rate soars in Polish ghettos. This is based, as the story says, on authoritative statistics. And again, what's striking is the amount of detail in these stories. So it's saying that there are 3 million Jews in 300 ghettos throughout Poland. These are authoritative statistics. Starvation stalks a ghetto with a death rate that's risen threefold in 2 months. Families are leaving corpses in the street because they have nowhere to bury them. That describes the daily bread ration, the ration for children, or in fact, the fact that children could no longer get a ration of milk. So very detailed stories. And then there are stories about the pogroms that were taking place in Romania during this period. There are some stories about the massacres, what we now call the Holocaust by bullets, that took place in the Soviet territories after the German invasion in June of 1971. And then for the last 3.5 years of the war, as the Germans moved from killing Jews by going to the places where they lived and massacring them, and instead set up extermination centers where Jews would be shipped first from Poland and then from all of Europe to be gassed. There were stories about that. Here is a story, and one of the striking things about this, you might see I'm going to do the headline here, 2 million murders by Nazis charged, but look, in the midst of Macy's Midsummer Furniture Show. And this is actually about what was taking place at Treblinka, and I'm not going to give you all of the horrible details, but what the story does in fact describe is women and children first, and then men being driven into the gas chambers by whips, and then gassed, and them taking the bodies out. So again, names Treblinka, names what's exactly happening. And then there are stories about the rising death rate. So again, very small story here, and here we look at it. 1 million Jews slain by Nazis, report says. And this is coming from the World Jewish Congress press conference, and most of the information, and we could talk a little bit about how the information got out during the question period if you want, but a lot of this was coming from the Polish government in exile, which had reconstituted itself in London, but maintained contacts with the underground in Poland. So first you get 1 million Jews are being killed, and then a year later, 3 million Jews have been killed, and then there are further updates, 4 million Jews have been killed. There are also first-person accounts. So this is German massacre of 15,000 detailed. This the story emerged after the Soviets had retaken parts of their territory and actually set up commissions to study war crimes. And this was the story of one woman in particular. She told the story to the New York Times correspondent who spoke Russian, but it's about the Kharkov Jews and how they were taken out of the city, put in wooden huts, and then, every so often a truck would show up, take who was ever living in a particular hut out to the outside of the territory, outside of the city, shoot them, and we're cleared out all 15,000 Jews in that fashion. And again, you can tell from the length of the story, very, very detailed, a lot of specifics, and the person is named. You also had some of what we would now consider the seminal events, such as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the rescue of Danish Jews, were followed in real time. This is actually the first report of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. You could see it's this tiny little story up there that says secret Polish radio ask aid, and then is cut off. And what the broadcast, the secret Polish radio, we couldn't tell from the headline what the story was about, but the last 35,000 Jews in the ghetto at Warsaw have been condemned to execution. Warsaw, again, is echoing to musketry volleys. The people are murdered. The people are murdered. Women and children defend themselves with their naked arms. Save us, is what the broadcast said. And then there's a story that goes into once the ghetto uprising is put down and the ghetto is destroyed. There's this story in the right-hand column. You see Jews' last stand felled 1,000 Nazis. And all of these stories were inside the newspaper. And then, towards the end of the war, you got cities, towns, countries where there are no longer Jews. And there are, again, short inside stories about that. So there's no question the information was available. But then when sort of the next level of argumentation was, well, the information may have been available, but it wasn't reliable. It was based on hearsay accounts or from biased Jewish sources. So one of the things that I looked at very carefully was, what was the source of this information? How was this getting to the West? What were the news stories saying about who was providing this information? And yes, some of it's coming from Jewish organizations like the World Jewish Congress, but it's also coming from German sources, both official and unofficial. It's coming from code breakers. It's coming from the exile governments, like the Polish government in exile. And anybody who knows anything about Polish-Jewish relations would not be willing to say that the Polish government in exile was a biased source in favor of the Jews. And probably most importantly is that it was confirmed by the Allied governments. First by our State Department, and then by all 11 of the Allied governments, including the United States and Great Britain. And that happened in December 1942. Now, this was, in fact, a front-page story. 11 allies condemned Nazi war on Jews. You can see it there sort of in the middle. And this is, a definitive statement of the governments. It's both was recognized as at the time as that this was absolute confirmation, and historically it is now considered this is the point at which there should no longer have been any doubt about whether the extermination campaign was actually going on. So it was confirmed officially. The idea that these were secondhand stories, yes, Some of them were, probably most of them were, but so is most journalism. You know, journalists don't get to witness most of the things that they write about. And as we saw with the story about Sarah Sokolow and the Kharkov Jews, some of them were first-person accounts. The stories often also said they were from reliable sources. The number of times where you find some sort of doubt expressed in the story is very rare. And probably most important is I didn't see any difference in treatment, meaning putting it on the front page versus putting it inside the newspaper based on the source, with two important exceptions that, again, we might want to talk about in the question and answer. One was the United States government, and the other was the Catholic Church. If the news was coming from those two sources, it was more likely to reach the front page, but that was the other difference, only other difference that I saw. So the information was available, it was reliable, but the next thing that's often been said is that it was unbelievable. And this is encapsulated in the phrase, too horrible to be true. So people at the time, because this wasn't the first genocide, because the Armenian genocide had already taken place and it had gotten a fair amount of press attention, but the idea that a state could kill so many people for racial or religious reasons was seemed to be unheard of at the time. And I still struggle with believing it, to tell you the truth. I mean, you read these stories and you just can't imagine how people could do this to other people. But I don't believe that was what kept it off of the front page. And here are a couple of my reasons. The first is the coverage didn't change after the Allied governments confirmed it. They still ran stories mostly in the inside. In fact, there were fewer front page stories in the New York Times in 1943 after the information was confirmed than there were in 1942. So that wasn't keeping it off of the front page. Another thing is that the stories don't read as if the people who were writing them or editing them didn't believe them. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I hope some of the others would also have convinced you, but I think these are particularly powerful. And this is taking place after the Germans have invaded Hungary in March of 1944. Hungary had been making some overtures to the Allies because they thought the Germans were going to lose the war. They had been an ally of Germany up until that point. When they started trying to negotiate with the Allies, then the Germans invaded Hungary in 1944 and immediately start rounding up Jews and shipping them off to Auschwitz-Birkenau to be murdered. And as I'm giving you sort of these stories, just be thinking if it sounds like the reporters or the editors don't believe the stories. So here's one. On page 5, Jews in Hungary fear annihilation. This is from May 10th, 1944. And this is the lead of the story. Although it may sound unbelievable, it is a fact that Hungary, where Jewish citizens were comparatively well treated until March 19th, is now preparing for the annihilation of Hungarian Jews by the most fiendish methods. The puppet Nazi government is completing plans and about to start the extermination of about 1 million human beings. And then the story goes on to say that they are about to meet the same fate as more than 5 million Jews who have already been, back in quotes, put to death in one form or another by the Germans, including in gas chamber baths. And that story appeared on page 5 of the New York Times. About a week later, there's another story, and it says, savage blow hits Jews in Hungary. The first paragraph reads, the first act in a program of mass extermination of Jews in Hungary is over, and 80,000 Jews of the Carpathian provinces have already disappeared. They have been sent to murder camps in Poland. Official reports from neutral diplomatic sources in Budapest emphasize that unless drastic measures are taken immediately to put an end to the Hungarian government's brutality, 1 million Jews are doomed. And that story also appeared on page 5 of the New York Times. In fact, all of the stories about the destruction of Hungarian Jews appeared on page 5 of the New York Times. And here's one last one that also sort of just gives you the sense that this was not surprising or unusual to the people who are writing this story. This is actually one where it's tacked on to the end of a story. The main part of the story is about Budapest children being ordered evacuated because of fears of Allied bombs. And then the last paragraph of the story just kind of tacks it on. A trainload of 2,500 Jewish men, women, and children was evacuated from the Kassa concentration ghetto Saturday night. If known schedules are adhered to, these victims will arrive in the Auschwitz and Birkenau camps by this weekend, probably with previous knowledge of their fate. And again, notice the specificity, 2,500 people, Saturday night. If known schedules are adhered to, this is how long it will take them to get to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And then it concludes, a German report just received in Zurich says railroad sidings have been constructed directly to the gassing halls in both establishments to expedite matter. So the stories don't read like the people don't believe them. And then on the editorial page, and there are very few editorials, but there are some, that would be the point where the Times could sort of step out and say, you know, we're getting these reports, they're really horrible, we're not really sure if they're true or not, but that's not what they say. So here you have this editorial, Hitler's Terror, and basically it says the fact that 2 million Jews have been killed and 5 million more are threatened, this is in December of 1942, it is official statement of the government based on officially established facts. And then the Times columnist, Ann O'Hara McCormick, writes, I mean, part of what a lot of these columns do is they acknowledge that people might have trouble believing this, but they go out of their way to say, we know that you're having trouble believing this, but you have to believe this. And this is what she writes. And this is in March 1943. The barbarities we have witnessed and hear of in the past 4 years are too nightmarish to be real, yet they represent dreadful realities. There is not the slightest question that the persecution of the Jews has reached its awful climax in a campaign to wipe them out of Europe. So, if the information was available, it was reliable, it was, for the most part, believable, there's one last explanation that's been given, and that is that there was just more important news. World War II is ongoing, there are battles all of the time, you know, that needed to be the front page stories. And to some extent, that is in fact true. I mean, this was a war for saving Western civilization. The Times and other American newspapers absolutely had to report on it and report up on it consistently. But, you know, as you saw when you saw that front page of the New York Times, there were 12 to 15 stories on the front page of the New York Times. And with the exception of the day after Pearl Harbor, the day after the Normandy invasion, not every single story was about the war. In fact, when I looked at it, it was about half. About half were about progress in the war and about half were about something else. And you even got stories like this. Oop, I didn't copy it. Okay, forget it. That was the one that was missing. All right. There was one that was missing, and that was it. But there was, on the day before the Normandy invasion, there was a story on the front page. Enraged bull kills 2 brothers, Gore's neighbor on Long Island. So the idea that there was literally no room on the front page doesn't make sense either. Yes, it wasn't considered as an important a story as these other stories, but that really begs the question. The question is, why wasn't it an important story? And in my last couple minutes, I'm going to try and offer at least some explanation for that. Although I have to say, after studying this for as long as I have, I still am not sure I get it. But I'll do the best I can in terms of my explanations. The first is that the US government didn't emphasize the story. Now, that doesn't mean they literally censored it and with some exceptions actually suppressed the news. They didn't. I mean, as you could see, these stories appeared, so they were not being censored or suppressed. But what the US government didn't do was it didn't highlight it. President Roosevelt never mentioned it in a fireside chat. He gave some speeches, but until 1944, none of them talked about Jews particularly. It was always kind of generalized atrocities. The same was true with the State Department, the Department of Defense, the Office of War Information, which was the US government's propaganda agency, put out a few press releases about this, but they never made it a campaign as they did with some other kinds of stories. So this was not something that they emphasized, and we could talk more about why that was. I mean, I think my best explanation is if this was something that really got on the public agenda, that they would then feel as if they had to do something about it. So it was better to just try and keep it out of the public agenda, and then they wouldn't have to figure out what steps they were going to take. So that's one possibility. But that doesn't completely explain it either. Because, as you can see from the stories that did appear, there was enough information out there. The newspapers were not dependent on the US government to get this kind of information. So they were still making a decision that this was not important. And I think the reason for that, in the case of most American newspapers, with the Times being an exception, as I'll explain in a second, was that this was happening to a foreign minority group that they just assumed that their readers wouldn't be terribly interested in. And let me just read you one quote from a journalist who was operating in Eastern Europe in 1944 and 1945. This is not a New York Times reporter. This was someone named Raymond Arthur Davis, and he was describing the attitude of American journalists. He said, editors cabled from Oh So Gentle America. Our readers are tired of horror stories. Cable only those of death rolls unusually large or deaths themselves unusually gruesome. Such stories could always be written on the basis of the experience of the Jews, but alas, the editors then cabled, Jewish atrocity stories are not acceptable news material. And then Raymond Arthur Davis almost sighed on the page. Ah, America, America. But as I said, I don't think that was as true of the New York Times as it was for the Dallas Morning News, for example. Half the Jews in America lived within the Times circulation area. It made up a substantial part of the Times audience. And these were, at this point, mostly first or second generation European Jews. In fact, half of the Jews in this Times circulation area were foreign-born and were from Europe. And that meant that in many cases, it was literally their mothers and fathers, their sisters and brothers being marched into the gas chamber. And that was true of my grandmother. I mean, and I'm sure a lot of you could think of that being true of relatives in the United States as well. So that's one problem with why is the Times not covering this. The other is that the owners of the Times were themselves Jewish, as were some of the reporters and editors who were handling this story. And the owners of the Times were not, as often portrayed, disconnected from the Jewish community. The publisher, Arthur Hay Sulzberger, was a member of 4 synagogues. He was on the board of the Jewish Theological Institute and the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. His wife was on the board of Hebrew Union College. And they also had relatives in Germany on both sides of the family, on both sides of both Sulzberger and his wife, which is where the New York Times was inherited from, were both Jews of German ancestry. So they began getting letters, as did most American Jews of German ancestry, as soon as the Nazis took over, for help in trying to get out of Germany. So in addition to their information they were getting from their reporting sources, they were also getting personal information about what was happening in Germany. But the irony and the tragedy is that because Arthur Hayes Sulzberger was Jewish, he was more likely to downplay what was happening to the Jews in Europe. And there are a couple reasons for that. One is he didn't want the Times to be considered a Jewish newspaper. He said that over and over again. So he didn't deny he was Jewish, as some people did during that time period. But he didn't want the Times to be known as a Jewish newspaper. And that's sort of, one thing if you're trying to decide whether to, how prominently to play a press release from the Zionist Organization of America. It's another thing when you're considering the persecution of Jews in Germany. But he wanted to appear as if he was neutral, to appear as if he wasn't engaged, as the term during the time period was, engaged in special pleading on behalf of a minority group he was a member of. So he played the story down so not to look as if he was playing the story up because he was Jewish. And as the persecution mounted, he also then came up with another explanation, which was, and he said this in letters, the Jews were a minority, and as a minority they couldn't save themselves, so they needed to merge their fate with that of other people, that they could not just be arguing on their own behalf. So that when they did write editorials about it, one of the things they emphasized was the Jews were the first to suffer, but now everybody's suffering from the Nazis, the Poles and the Danes and the French. So this is not just about the Jews. And, maybe that made sense strategically, or maybe it didn't. But what it meant was that it wasn't possible to forge a special way of helping the Jews, that fed into the Roosevelt administration's objective, which was just to win the war and not let anything deter them from that. Another factor that had to do with Sulzberger in particular was that he was strongly anti-Zionist. He was not bashful about it. This was very, very important to him. He, as a religious matter, thought that Jews were just a religion. They weren't a people. If you're not, or an ethnic group, just people who went to synagogue on Saturday instead of church on Sunday. And therefore, if you believe that, there couldn't be a Jewish state because Jews were not a people. And this manifested itself during this time period because, especially by 1943, the only hope for getting a lot of Jews out of Europe was for them to go to Palestine. So the fights about Zionism in both directions, actually, really derailed the possibility of Jewish unity and a unified proposal for rescuing the Jews of Europe. And this sort of sensitivity to Semitism, so to speak, affected the whole news organization. I mean, everybody on this story more than any other, everyone, the editors, the reporters, looked to Sulzberger for leadership. And his hesitance, reticence on playing up this story infected the entire organization. So what was the impact of this that goes beyond this particular newspaper? And look at other news media as well. I think the Times had a disproportionate impact upon government leaders and other journalists at the time. However important the New York Times is now as an agenda setter, it was much more important in its time period. I mean, surveys of journalists said 100% of journalists read the New York Times. Government leaders, that was the first newspaper they went to, particularly on foreign affairs, because most other newspapers in America didn't have the interest or the resources to cover foreign affairs. And I think the attitude was, everyone knew, despite Sulzberger's, we're not a Jewish newspaper, knew that the Times was owned by Jews. And the attitude was, if a Jewish-owned newspaper doesn't think this story is important, why should we? So I think that it resonated beyond the Times itself. In addition, because this never sort of emerged as a consistent front page story. And again, I remind you, there were only 6 stories that made clear on the front page that Jews were being persecuted. That meant that the story really didn't get on the public agenda. It was there, and if you were a careful reader of the Times, you absolutely would have known what was happening to the Jews in Europe as it was happening. But if you were a casual reader, which is what most readers are, you probably missed the story. You probably didn't know it. And that meant there was never a real possibility of arousing public opinion to sort of push for some kind of rescue agenda. Now, that doesn't mean, and I really want to be careful here, that if it was on the front page, it would have necessarily aroused public opinion. I don't know. I actually, in light even of current events, I have my doubts. But it is safe to say that the possibility was never really tested because of the way the press covered this story. So what are some of the lessons we can take from that? I mean, the first thing, and I think this is beginning to happen or is happening more than it was when I started talking about this, which is that, oh, and let me just show you a picture of Arthur Sulzberger. I had that here. That we have to stop saying the information wasn't available, that we have to call people out on it whenever it's said, because it's just not true. And it's a conversation stopper, right? I mean, if the information was available, if nobody could know, then you can't be thinking about, well, why were people indifferent? Why did not much be done? You have to start with the understanding that the information was available and reached the United States. I think for journalists, part of what this means is also that just getting the facts out there is not enough. And probably, again, even more so in our current contemporary period. Because then there's still, the New York Times was an authoritative source. People did look to it. Now there are so many media sources that it makes it even more important to try, if a story is important, if people need to know it, to try and sort of rise above the din of social media. And in doing that, as sort of mainstream journalists, not people doing TikToks, you shouldn't assume that your audience wouldn't be interested. I mean, that is what, at the time, and it's sort of in retrospect, a lot of journalists said, well, these were foreigners, they were minorities, nobody would be interested. But it's your obligation as a journalist, if it's important, to figure out how to make your readers understand what is going on. And I'm going to close with an example that is now, again, sort of part of history, which is what the New York Times did after 9/11. And some of you may remember this. If you don't, you should take a look at it, which is the Times, after 3,000 Americans were killed, decided they were going to do something called Portraits of Grief. And what they did was, after the attacks, every day, maybe one page, maybe a page and a half, they would do, little biographies of the people who were killed, not sort of big deals. They would, talk about where they worked and what family they had and maybe what their hobbies were, but it made you get a sense of what it was like to lose 3,000 people. The number means nothing, and I think we're seeing this now too as we try to come to grips with some of the 1,400 Israelis who were killed, that learning an individual story, sometimes, and they tried to have photos then too, is what it takes to make people understand that. And when the Times started doing this, this was actually, before my book came out, I was thinking, what if the Times had done that with the Holocaust? What if they had tried to do something to individualize the deaths? But of course, you do that and you realize they would have had to devote every single page of every single newspaper during the entirety of the war to portraits of grief, because that's what it means to lose 6 million people. And I don't know if they had done that or something like that, it would have made a difference, but I do know they should have tried. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Leff. Very relevant discussion for today.
Do we want to keep looking at Arthur Sulzberger? Leave him up there?
No, let's don't look at him anymore. Okay, so first question. How would you characterize the stories that other major newspapers were publishing during World War II? Were they more or less accurate, or presented with more importance than the New York Times?
Yeah, so as I said, the Times was more comprehensive. I mean, that was just generally true. They had a bigger news hole, they had more stories that they published, they had more foreign reporters, so they were doing more of these stories. Most of the press coverage was similar in the sense that it wasn't consistently front page stories. They tended to be inside the newspaper. There were some exceptions, however. And the exceptions actually tended to be, so there was the Jewish papers, which would be an exception, the Jewish newspapers, but it also tended to be the liberal newspapers. So there was a newspaper called PM, which, as its name suggests, was an afternoon newspaper in New York. It was founded by Marshall Field, actually, of the Chicago department store chain, and he set it up to be specifically a liberal newspaper, and they did a much better job covering these issues, as did The Nation and the New Republic. I think they saw Jews as an oppressed minority group that was deserving of attention, so they did give it much more. But the most mainstream media had fewer stories than the Times, but had the basic same kind of coverage.
Was there any fact-checking back in 1940s, and how were stories verified to be true?
So, even today, most, and I'm not saying this to be cynical, but most newspapers don't engage in fact-checking, at least in the sense of a reporter provides the story with the facts and then somebody else double-checks them. Usually there just isn't the time for that if you're on a daily schedule, let alone on an hourly schedule. What you do is you have to trust your reporters that they're giving you accurate information, and if you have a reporter, and I was an editor for a number of years, so I know how this works. If you have a reporter who consistently gets the kinds of complaints that make you doubt whether they're being particularly accurate, then that becomes a problem, and either they have to shape up or they're no longer employed at the newspaper. So that was the fact-checking process then. It was a fact-checking process now. Some of the reporters who are reporting on this story had kind of dubious reputations, but that again was a reflection of the initial decision that this wasn't an important story. So their top reporters were not on this story. They were off covering the war, or covering other kind of international affairs, so it tended to be the second stringers. Some of whom were fine reporters, but they were not sort of the stars at the newspaper. But that was because it was already decided that this wasn't an important story.
Do you see any similarities with how the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas war are being covered?
That's really hard. I think. I have impressions. I think we all have impressions. But one of the things doing this reporting, doing this book convinced me of is that you really need to study it systematically in order to have a good handle on what was being done. That just your sense of and we can all talk about stories that were reported badly. But to really have a sense of overall coverage, you need to take a look at many stories. And one of the problems, I think, is that in this story, too many people just assumed that there wasn't coverage and didn't bother to look, or assumed that they knew what the stories were like. And let me just give you one example. There was a researcher at Harvard who was actually very sympathetic on this, and he set out to what was the New York Times coverage of the Holocaust like. And so he started in 1933, and he looked at the stories about the rise of Nazi Germany and the persecution of the Jews, and then he got to the war in 1939, and he stopped. He stopped, and then he jumped ahead to 1945 because he was so convinced there weren't any stories there. So I guess I would hold off on that, which is not to say I necessarily want to take that on, but hopefully people will. I think that was what Mr. Berman said during his talk, and I do think that will happen, and at that point we'll have a better sense.
Thank you. Why do you think, given the Holocaust and what many know about it, that anti-Semitism is still so acceptable?
Wow, that's a hard one.
That's a hard one.
That's a hard one. What would I say about... I guess part of what I would say is to just confess that I was surprised or have been surprised. Not to say that I thought anti-Semitism had gone away, but I thought it was on the fringes, that it wasn't the potent force that it now seems to be. And I think my naivete, and I will describe it as that, came somewhat from just, and I guess I'm going to sound like a German Jew now, but the success that Jews had in America, and the comfort that most of us felt in being in the United States, so that we just didn't quite, at least in the little, pockets that I lived in, didn't quite understand how virulent it was, how deep it was, how mixed up it is in religion and conspiracy theories and all the other things that makes it a unique form of hatred.
Yeah. Good answer to a very difficult question. Why did you decide to investigate the Times coverage of the Holocaust?
Well, I gave you some indication of it in the talk, which is that I had grown up thinking that Americans didn't know about the Holocaust, why it was happening. That was literally what I was taught. It was taught in Hebrew school. I don't think I was taught anything about it in actual school. I was part of the culture. This was something Americans only realized when the camps were liberated. And then when a scholar named Deborah Lipstadt, who's now the White House representative on anti-Semitism, did a book in the mid-'80s called Beyond Belief about the fact that most American newspapers had all of these stories. When I learned of this book and then read it, I was like, why was I taught just like 2 decades after the event that nobody knew about it when there were stories in American newspapers? That just didn't make sense to me. And then, so that was sort of my reaction, I think, as an American Jew. And then my reaction as a journalist was, why were these stories on the inside pages? I mean, that also just, as a journalist, just as a matter of how you decide what's important, that didn't seem to make sense to me either. So that's why I decided to write the book. Decided to do it by looking at one newspaper in particular, because again, having spent years as a reporter and then as an editor, I knew that sometimes quirky things happen in institutions, that who the editor is, who the publisher is. I mean, one of the odd things about the New York Times was the editor of the paper. People said he had a gambling problem. The managing editor always left the newsroom at 6 o'clock and was not interested in what stories were going to go on the front page of the newspaper, and left the paper in the hands of the assistant night managing editor, who was not particularly interested in stories about Jews. And in fact, he was a devout Catholic, and one of the things that I found was that there were more front-page stories about the persecution of Catholics and Christians on the front page of the New York Times than there were about the persecution of Jews. And so some of that was that was what he was interested in, that was what he cared about. So it seemed as if, looking at one newspaper was the way to sort of get at some of those personality questions as well as the overall questions. And then, of course, the fact that the Times was owned by a Jewish family made the coverage more, or the way that it was covered, more intriguing at the least.
So you mentioned that 2 of the times that the plight of the Jews made the first page related to messages from the government and from the Catholic Church. Yeah. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so, and I should say, one one of the things, I maybe probably underestimated the role of public pressure. There was actually a pressure campaign in 1943 that did result in the creation of a war refugee board. It was very late in the war. It was dramatically underfunded. They gave them $1 million to run this agency that's supposed to save the remaining Jews in Europe. 90% of the money had to be raised from private sources, so this is a government agency, but it was dependent completely on Jewish organizations to raise the money, had a very, very small staff. But even that organization, once they existed and started like putting out press releases, the year that the War Refugee Board is created, which is 1944, you end up with 10 front page stories that are somewhat connected to the Jews, and that's because of the work of the War Refugee Board. I also then found that when there was, the Pope had said something. I mean, there's even a story where the Pope was maybe going to do something, and that became a front page story. They would write about conditions in France particularly, and they would all be the liquidation of French Jews was on the inside pages, but if one priest had helped a Jew, that showed up on the front page. So that was kind of the way it worked.
Makes sense. Have you given much thought to what might have happened, what help could have been given to the Jews if the Holocaust had been more widely reported on the front page and more emphasized?
I think it's important to say that the Holocaust would not have been stopped. This was, most of these murders were in fact taking place in German-controlled territory. The Germans, as we all know, were maniacal about killing the Jews. Even when it was clear, or maybe even particularly when it was clear they were going to lose the overall war, they became even more determined to win the war against the Jews. So I don't think even more coverage could have stopped that. But I do think that there were serious rescue measures on the table that if the public was more, aroused, that could have been considered more seriously and more seriously earlier. There's another sort of wrinkle that's been, I've been doing, and this is my more recent work is looking at immigration and looking at the quota system. So this would have been before the war, but one of the, and again, we've been told the wrong story, which is the wrong story is that the reason more Jews weren't able to come from Europe was because there were quotas, and that there's some truth to that story, but what's also true is the quotas were only filled 1 year during the war. Most of the time the quotas were very undersubscribed, and that's because of the way the State Department was administering them. And I do think that if the State Department wasn't allowed to get away with, filling 5% of the German quota in 1933 and 10% of it in 1934, that at least another 350,000 people could have come to the United States. So that's another kind of concrete thing that could have been done. And again, it was successful obfuscation. If you change legislation, you increase quotas or decrease quotas through congressional legislation, everybody knows it, there are reporters on it, but if you're just doing it through administrative measures and there's somebody sitting in Hamburg across from a family that wants to come to the United States and you just turn down their visas, nobody sees it, nobody knows, and it's a lot easier to get away with it.
So clearly today the journalism landscape is vastly different because of social media. And there's so much good information, but a lot of misinformation with social media. But we also know that there's bias in major media sources. What advice would you have for us as consumers of the news to ensure that we're getting the facts? Clearly we need to be going to page 10 and not the front page, right? But what other advice do you have for us?
And I guess this is also just my background. I came out of, mainstream newspapers, and I still think that authoritative sources are important, that you need to have the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Boston Globe and then Dallas Morning News sifting through all the information out there and hopefully making determinations about what's accurate, what's not accurate, what they're not sure is accurate, and even what's important. I mean, I don't think we can get away from that. There isn't just, it'd be nice if there was some like objective measure out there. Oh, here, clearly we all know this is important, we all know this isn't not important, and especially when it's happening in real time. So I still believe in the mainstream media. I guess what I would add to that, though, is because we're more sophisticated consumers of the news, and also maybe even more importantly, because we have so much greater ability to have access to lots of different sources, that means we have to put pressure on the mainstream media to make sure that they are being accurate and telling us truthful things. And if things are not truthful, I mean, I think there was a fairly good response to it came too late, which is often what happens, but when the newspapers, including the New York Times, said the Israelis had bombed a Gaza hospital, it was very unfortunate that they said it that way, but I think there was some correction. And in fact, the New York Times corrected themselves. I mean, again, it was late, but at least it happened. And I think that's partially because we are kind of paying attention and noticing when those things happen. So, I mean, that's not in any way a perfect solution, but we can't just rely on TikToks. I mean, I'll say that for sure.
Please no. Can you tell us about your current research? What can we look forward to?
Yeah, so I'm taking a look at the American Catholic Church and their response to the Holocaust. Uh-huh. And doing that through looking at...
When can we have you come back? Yeah? A couple years?
Maybe 2 years.
Okay.
I think it's very slow because there are a lot of American Catholic. The way I'm doing it, at least initially, is by looking at American Catholic newspapers, because there were about 100 of those. Most of them were run by the diocese itself. So what that means is these were not sort of independent sources. These were the position of the American Catholic Church. And it is, as shocked as I was by the New York Times coverage of the Holocaust, I have to tell you, I have been so much more shocked by the way the American Catholic Church responded. It's going to be a little dicey.
It's hard to say that we look forward to learning about that, but it's important to know about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think so, but... and it's a piece of there's been a lot of looking at the Vatican, but no one has really looked at the American Catholic Church, which is taking direction from the Vatican, but also has its own interests in the United States. So
in our exhibition, we cover Father Coughlin's horrific anti-Semitism.
I mean, I actually once did we're putting together a panel called Beyond Father Coughlin, because one of the things is that again, how the history is told, he's been presented as sort of an outlier. He was the bad guy and everybody else was okay. Not true.
Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you all for having me.
Thanks for sharing your research.
Do we have an update on the Rangers?
We do have an update on the Rangers. The score is 0-0 at the beginning of the fifth inning.
You miss nothing. It's all
You can get home and see the important stuff. Professor Leff will be signing books in the lobby, so feel free to come by and get a book signed or visit with her. Thank you all so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, and look at our program calendar. We have a couple of great programs coming up. Hope to see you soon.